He took to the city instantly and soon found work at a paper called the Aurora, one of the dozens of new penny papers springing up all over the island. There had never been anything like them. Sold on the streets for a penny apiece by gangs of ragged boys, they were filled not with sober shipping reports, but with eye-catching stories of crime, vice, and sex, often drawn from the streets of the city itself. Of them all, none was more popular than the New York Herald, founded in 1835 by a bombastic Scottish immigrant named James Gordon Bennett, fond of comparing himself in the pages of his own journal to Julius Caesar, Shakespeare, and Alexander the Great.
Up until the 1830s, newspapers had very small circulation, they were quite expensive, and they were always effectively owned by one political party. It was James Gordon Bennett who changed all of that. He put all the ideas together and came up with the New York Herald, which became the most successful newspaper in the world. It was very low priced, it was politically independent, and it was written not with the idea of instructing the reader with what he ought to know, but with giving the reader what he wanted to know.
Modern journalism had begun. In its first 2 weeks alone, the Herald ran blood-curdling accounts of 3 suicides, 3 murders, a fire that killed 5 people, and an accident in which a man had blown his own head off.
Monday, February 1st, 1841. There is a paper published in this city. I am not in the habit of quoting from it, for I consider it a disgrace. Nor would I do it now, but to protest against the depraved and vitiated taste of newspaper readers. It is an undeniable fact that this filthy sheet has a wider circulation than any other, not only here, but in other cities. Philip Hone.
Reporters like Whitman went everywhere, covering the spectacular fires that broke out with increasing frequency now, and the epidemics of cholera that ravaged the increasingly congested slums.
I think the fiction of New York history and New Yorkers' self-perception is that they were the most tolerant people in the world, the cosmopolitan New Yorker, able to accept anyone who came. The reality of New York history reveals quite a bit more tension and conflict in the actual day-to-day social relations of New Yorkers.
This was never say that welcomed immigrants. If you read the history of New York, whichever group was coming at the time, everyone hated. And then the group that got here 5 minutes before them had someone to look down on, and that's always been the case.
June 2nd, 1836. There arrived at this port during the month of May 15,825 passengers. All Europe is coming across the ocean. All that part, at least, who cannot make a living at home. And what shall we do with them? They increase our taxes, eat our bread, and encumber our streets. And not 1 in 20 is competent to keep himself. Philip Hone.
For years, the number of immigrants coming into the city had been on the rise as the demand for workers grew. By 1840, more than 50,000 Germans had pushed in, settling in an insulated neighborhood of their own called Klein-Deutschland, or Little Germany. An even greater number had emigrated from Ireland, impoverished farmers and unskilled day laborers mainly, most of whom quickly found work, taking on the worst and toughest jobs in the city, digging sewers, paving streets, building houses, or working as servants, scullery maids, and seamstresses. By 1842, nearly 100,000 Irish immigrants had flooded into New York City, fueling waves of virulent anti-Catholic bigotry and the bitter resentment of native-born workers who feared for their jobs.
It's very hard for people nowadays to realize there was a white, Christian, English-speaking immigrant group that was essentially seen as another race, so foreign that they could never be absorbed into the United States. Their arrival really in the 1840s triggers the growth of the American Party, as it's called at the time, or the Know-Nothing Party, which is essentially said we have to stop the immigration of these people to the country. They're going to destroy our identity. They can never be loyal because of their loyalty to the Catholic Church. They don't want to work, they're shiftless, they're violent. This was the perception.
One of the most interesting things about the Irish is the kind of discrimination that they faced when they came to New York. All of the cartoons of the period show them with huge brows, show them drunk all the time, show them involved in fights and brawls. The Irish were called the blacks of the 19th century. They were not considered to be white.
Ethnic conflict had already reached alarming levels on the streets of the city, when in the summer of 1845, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions in the Irish countryside sent a tidal wave of desperate people streaming towards New York. In the years to come, the influx of famine Irish immigrants would overwhelm the city's resources completely and change forever the social and political balance of the metropolis.
The Great Migration begins in 1845. Between 1845 and 1855, you have 1 million people die in Ireland in the potato famine, the great defining event of modern Irish history. 2.1 million leave. Of the 1.5 that come to the United States, 1 million come across South Street in a 10-year period. And it's an immigration very unlike the immigrations that follow. One, because it's in sailing ships. It's not in the steamships that become the regular vessel across the Atlantic in 7 days. This is a 30-day passage. Some of them were called coffin ships because there were more people dead on them than alive when they landed. And you have 1 million people, 1/8 of the Irish nation comes across South Street in a 10-year period. There's no other immigration from Europe like that in the 19th century.
Hundreds of our people, just cast on shore from the immigrant ships, parade daily the streets of New York as howling beggars. They sleep in droves in the station houses, the commissioners supplying them with bread. In the morning, they wander over the city, begging.
No city on earth had ever had to contend with such an onslaught of humanity. In 1854, an old concert hall at the foot of Manhattan, called Castle Garden, was pressed into service to handle the flood tide of impoverished newcomers. By then, there were more Irish in New York City than any other place in the world except Dublin. And still they came on, pushing the congestion in the new slums to more than 300 people per acre. 5 times the density city fathers had anticipated when laying out the street plan 50 years before.
The huge famine Irish immigration that hit in the 40s brought here a rural people who had no urban skills. Many of them had no English, and settled into pretty miserable conditions pretty fast.
As thousands of Irish immigrants pushed into the Five Points, one of the only areas in the city where African Americans could afford to live, the two groups were thrown into increasingly bitter competition for the worst dwellings and the lowest paying jobs.
Every hour sees us elbowed out of some employment, to make room, perhaps, for some newly arrived immigrants, whose hunger and color are thought to give them title to a special favor. Frederick Douglass.
We'd like to think that segregation is a Southern phenomenon. It's not. It's a Northern phenomenon. And there are black burial grounds, and there are white burial grounds. There are black sections in churches, the nigger pews up in the top. So racism is built into the very structure and culture of the city, and it's only exacerbated by the new arrivals.
Profit-hungry New York businessmen only made matters worse, hiring Irish laborers instead of blacks because they would work for even less money, then using blacks as strikebreakers whenever the Irish threatened a walkout for better wages. By 1855, the two groups with the most in common in New York were locked in a life-and-death struggle on the lowest rung of the city's economic ladder. In the Fifth Ward, and what was now called the Bloody Sixth, rival gangs of Protestants and Catholics vied for control of the streets, striking terror in the hearts of middle-class New Yorkers, like the conservative lawyer George Templeton Strong, who now retreated even farther uptown.
November 13th, 1854. Met a prodigious know-nothing procession moving uptown as I omnibused down Broadway to the vestry meeting. A most emphatic and truculent demonstration. They looked as if they might have designs on St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I think the Celts of Prince and Mott Streets would have found them ugly customers. We may well have the tremendous riot and carnage here at any moment. George Templeton Strong.
By 1854, the chaos on the city streets had reached all the way to City Hall. That fall, to the horror of many upper-class New Yorkers, a slippery and corruptible one-time liquor store owner named Fernando Wood swept into the mayor's office on a tide of Irish and German votes, backed by a new force in city politics called Tammany Hall.
The important point about Wood is that he was really the first New York politician to sort of nakedly mobilize the votes of these immigrants, of the working classes, with the promise of sort of paying them off with jobs, with patronage, with favors, and so on and so forth. For the middle class and upper class genteel elite of New York, that seemed to be a very frightening thing indeed, because it really suggested that politics was now going to be worked out in a very, very different kind of way.
By 1857, New York was on the verge of what George Templeton Strong called municipal civil war. That spring, Wood's Republican opponents, determined to drive the Democrat from office, had the state legislature rewrite the city charter, stripping the mayor of most of his powers. On June 17th, two rival police departments, Wood's Municipals and the state-run Metropolitans, rioted on the steps of City Hall, in the heart of what the New York Times called the worst governed city in the world. In the summer of 1857, Whitman's hopes for his democratic island city were dealt a grievous blow. In the last weeks of August, 20 years of frenzied speculation on Wall Street came to a shocking end when panic swept through the financial district, precipitating the severest economic crisis in the nation's history.
September 28th, 1857. Panic is very dreadful in Wall Street. Failures are multiplying, and no one knows on whom he can depend or on what. October 10th. We seem foundering. Affairs are worse than ever today, and a period of general insolvency seems close upon us. People's faces in Wall Street look fearfully gaunt and desperate. November 10th. This financial crisis has thrown thousands of the working class out of employment and made it a difficult matter enough to maintain peace and order in the city through the winter. George Templeton Strong.
For the country's growing urban population, the panic was nothing less than a disaster. Walt Whitman estimated that in New York alone, more than 25,000 people were soon out of work, and 100,000 more facing hardship and even starvation. Hardest hit were those with the fewest resources, the immigrant poor and the city's beleaguered black population.
We're talking about a period where there's no Social Security, there's no unemployment relief, there's no Medicare or Medicaid. There is not that social safety net yet that's erected in the 20th century that helps to ease some of that. And so when you're unemployed, or when you're widowed, or your child is in trouble with the law, you're hurt, you're injured, life is very, very tough for those people.
In the fall of 1857, as banks failed and businesses closed, and thousands of unemployed New Yorkers wandered the city streets homeless, the state authorities, now in control of New York, embarked upon one of the greatest public works projects ever undertaken in an American city. It would be the most ambitious attempt yet to make Whitman's democratic island city a concrete reality. By 1860, the main features of Central Park were nearing completion. But Olmsted and Vaux's masterpiece had done little to ease the tensions dividing the troubled city. And by then, few New Yorkers and few Americans were thinking about parks anyway. The unrest that had been building in the city for half a century was about to be overtaken by the worst crisis in American history. In the conflict to come, New York would play a role more eventful and strange than anyone could have imagined. At 11:30 on the morning of Saturday, February 25th, 1860, a tall, gangling man in an ill-fitting black coat and battered beaverskin hat stepped off the Cortlandt Street ferry in Manhattan. A lawyer and ex-congressman, little known outside his home state of Illinois, he had come to New York hoping to bolster his slim chances of winning the Republican presidential nomination. When no one met him at the dock on arrival, Abraham Lincoln found his way alone to the Astor House Hotel across from City Hall on Broadway.
Lincoln comes to town in 1860. What does he do? He goes to the Astor Hotel, which is where the celebrities stay. They give the announcement of this to the local newspapers, which are right across the street, and they write this up. New York is already becoming an engine of celebrity creation.
On Sunday, the candidate took the ferry to Brooklyn to hear the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher rail against slavery. Back in Manhattan, he attended a minstrel show on the Bowery, roaring with delight at a new hit tune, written in Manhattan the year before, called Dixie. Everything was riding on the speech Lincoln was to give at the Cooper Institute on Monday. That afternoon, in a pouring rain, he stopped by Knox's hat store on Broadway and traded in his old beaverskin for a shiny silk top hat. Then crossed over to Matthew Brady's Daguerrean studio to sit for a formal portrait. As evening came and the rain turned to snow, Lincoln's worry about the turnout began to mount. But the New York press corps had done its work, and by 7:30, more than 1,500 people had filled the great hall of Cooper Union to capacity, to give the odd-looking Westerner with the high nasal voice a hearing. Stifled laughter rippled through the hall as the candidate began to speak. But the crowd grew quiet as he warmed to his theme, imploring his listeners with passionate logic to restrict the spread of slavery.
Pretty soon I forgot his clothes, his appearance, and his peculiarities. Presently, forgetting myself, I was on my feet with the rest, yelling like a wild Indian, cheering this wonderful man. When I came out of the hall, a friend with his eyes aglow asked me what I thought about Abe Lincoln, the rail splitter. I said, he's the greatest man since St. Paul. And I think so yet.
The next morning, Lincoln woke to find himself a national celebrity. No man, Horace Greeley wrote in the New York Tribune, ever before made such an impression on his first appeal to a New York audience. His speech had been reprinted in full in the daily papers and in pamphlets that were already making their way across the country, together with reproductions of Matthew Brady's photograph. Looking back, Lincoln never forgot what his 3-day sojourn in New York City had done for him. Matthew Brady and the Cooper Institute, he said simply, made me president. On November 15th, 1860, 1 week after Lincoln's election, a giant meteor could be seen illuminating the skies above the city. Omens, auguries, and portents dire, the New York Times declared. Lincoln's startling rise confirmed the worst Southern fears. The North and its rapidly expanding cities were going to destroy the Southern way of life. Within days, South Carolina had called for a special session of the state legislature to consider seceding from the Union. In New York, merchants and bankers with Southern investments grew uneasy.
New York was a southern city. It was the southernmost city north of the Mason-Dixon line because, in fact, its fate relied upon the slave system. We carried southern goods, we insured southern goods, we financed the purchase of slaves. We were totally imbricated in the southern slave system. This meant that with the approach of war and the increasing north-south cultural hostilities, New York was the most reluctant of any place to come to some kind of break because they knew that they would have the most to lose.
First of all, they didn't want to break up what was a very prosperous trading situation with the Confederate States. And secondly, they knew full well that the estimated $40 million owed to them by Southerners would likely not be paid in the event of hostilities.
On January 21st, 1861, fearing that war would interrupt the lucrative cotton trade, Mayor Fernando Wood suggested that New York itself secede from the Union.
And in fact, they passed a sort of non-binding agreement of secession or statement of secession in which New York declared itself the Empire City of the South and dedicated therefore more to its commercial ties than its political ties with the Union and Lincoln.
Saturday, April 13th, 1861. This morning's papers confirmed last night's news that the rebels opened fire at Sumter yesterday morning. So civil war is inaugurated at last. God defend the right. George Templeton Strong.
When news reached the divided city that the Confederates had fired on Fort Sumter, an immense tide of pro-Union sentiment swept through New York. There was now no turning back. On April 20th, 1861, 250,000 merchants, clerks, and working men jammed Union Square for a rally in support of the Northern cause. It was, Horace Greeley said, the greatest popular demonstration ever known in America.
April 20th, 1861. Walked uptown at 2. Broadway crowded and more crowded as one approached Union Square. Large companies of recruits parading up and down, cheered and cheering. Every other man, woman, and child bearing a flag or decorated with a cockade. The city seems to have gone suddenly wild and crazy. George Templeton Strong.
So the city and country went to war. Before it was over, more than 150,000 New Yorkers, including 50,000 Irishmen, tens of thousands of Germans, and 8,000 blacks, would fight for the Union cause. Frederick Law Olmsted resigned from his post at Central Park to help run the U.S. Sanitary Commission. He would soon be responsible for the health and well-being of hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers. Walt Whitman would soon go south, too, as a volunteer in the crowded Washington hospitals. George Templeton Strong, too old at 41 for active duty, helped train a brigade of local sharpshooters called the New York Rifles.
The Civil War was the first industrialized war ever. And it produced an industrial North to make it possible. The machines, the mills, the factories roaring out. And New York was the financial capital of that new capitalist world. It was in that white heat of the war that industrial America finally emerged.
The war was incredibly beneficial for New York City. The manufacturers of uniforms, of saddles, of leather goods, of guns, you name it, in fact, we're making money hand over fist.
And yet, while industrialists and war profiteers grew rich, the conflict would bring hardship and misery to tens of thousands of ordinary New Yorkers. As rents climbed, inflation soared, and the casualties mounted. It would also bring to a tragic climax antagonisms that had been building for years. Between rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, Protestant and Catholic, white and black. All those tensions would come to a head in the long, hot summer of 1863. And when the trouble came, it would begin with the most wretched and despised of the city's beleaguered citizens.
Resentment had been building for a very long time. There are class animosities that have riven the city. The Irish, for instance, have been proselytized and missionized and invaded by these Protestant missionaries who have been out to reform them, who have decided that they're subpar, in some cases barely subhuman, certainly heathens, or certainly the wrong religion. These people are finding themselves, many of them, with their wages, in fact, going steadily down, the quality of their living arrangements, in fact, going down. But there's a lot of people who are getting the short end of the stick, and they find it now exacerbated by the wartime conditions, but the draft triggers it.
By 1863, opposition to the war had been growing for more than a year, especially amongst the Irish. As one Union defeat followed another, and the horrifying casualty lists grew longer, anger towards the government intensified. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had taken effect on the first of the year, and which asked whites to fight and die for the freedom of blacks, only made matters worse. But it was the passage of the Conscription Act in the spring of 1863, the first federal draft in American history, that aroused the most fury. It authorized the government to draft hundreds of thousands of men into the Union Army against their will. Anyone with $300 to spare, meanwhile, nearly a year's wages for most working men, could buy their way out. For the Irish, it was the last straw.
The opinion among the Irish was that emancipation would result in hordes of blacks coming north and working for less than they did, and they were working for minimum wages as it was. But the reality was that the oldest ethnic group in New York next to the Dutch are African Americans. And it was the Irish immigrants who had really driven African Americans out of serving jobs and hauling waste and every menial job there was. The Irish had taken those jobs. They were making it harder in the 1860s for African Americans to get jobs. But the Irish fear was that emancipation would result in blacks taking their jobs. And the rich don't have to fight in this war because they can pay $300 to get out of it. It was a perceived injustice, and in some ways I think it was a real injustice.
In June 1863, the war moved closer to home, when Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee invaded the North, spreading terror throughout the Union and threatening Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York itself. As the July date set for New York's draft lottery approached, fear and resentment amongst the city's immigrant poor began to seethe out of control.
In, I think, 59, 60, in the campaign that Lincoln was elected in, a Southerner wrote a book, which was a science fiction scenario, what would happen if? And he spelled out a possibility that included great riots breaking out in northern cities along class lines of the Irish rising, armies having to pull back to deal with them, and the South becoming triumphant. And that scenario, was arguably within an ace of being played out.
On the 4th of July, word reached New York by telegraph that more than 50,000 men had fallen outside a tiny town in Pennsylvania, only 150 miles away, called Gettysburg. 1 week later, on Saturday, July 11th, 1863, drawings began at the Uptown Draft Office on 3rd Avenue near 46th Street. The first to be called was a man named Jones. By 6 that night, more than 1,200 names had been pulled from the drum.
If you want to date the metropolis of New York, you can date it from the draft riots. It was a defining moment in the city. It had a world-class riot. That's a mark of a world-class city. I mean, Paris, London have had tremendous social explosions, and New York became a world-class city with a world-class riot. This was, in a way, in an ironic way, it was a mark of the city's arrival, I think, on the world stage, that you could have violence on this scale.
I think that the draft riots really provide a kind of wake-up call for the elite and middle class of New York, because it is a demonstration of, in the phrase of the day, the volcano under the city. It was a demonstration of the enormous number of poor, desperate, angry people who were there and who represented a threat to the city.
The draft riots marked a crucial turning point in the history of New York City. In the decades to come, New Yorkers would begin to enlarge their sense of what a city should be. It was a struggle that would take generations to achieve and never really end. But it had begun. Within months, the first modern fire department had been organized, and the police department greatly expanded. New forms of public transportation would soon begin to ease the tremendous congestion in Lower Manhattan. And by 1866, a Metropolitan Board of Health had been formed, the first of its kind in the country, as doctors plunged into the slums to assess the sanitary conditions of the poor. Their findings shocked New Yorkers and forced the city to pass the first laws regulating housing in the United States. It is shameful, George Templeton Strong wrote, that men, women, and children should be permitted to live in such holes.
What's important about the 1867 law is that it establishes the principle, for really the first time in American history, that government in general has the right to establish some minimal standards of livability and safety and quality.
And there were other consequences of the riots, even more momentous. In 1863, the year of the uprising, an ex-fireman from the Five Points named William M. Tweed was named Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall. One of his first acts was to push through a special low-interest loan program that enabled poor New Yorkers as well as rich to buy their way out of the draft. In the decades to come, New York's immigrant poor would begin to acquire a voice in urban politics for the first time.
The draft riots, which the Irish were fundamental players in 1863, were horrible. The behavior was unspeakable in some cases, some parts of it. But when they were over, people knew that there was no way to deal with political power in New York City without finding out how to deal with the Irish. And I'm not saying that violence is the way to get people to respect you, but by 1870, they ran Tammany Hall.